Hi everyone, Peter here from Flow High Performance, and in this video we will cover how lifting performance can be used as an indicator for muscle growth. First, let's quickly define what both strength and hypertrophy are. Strength is simply how much weight we can lift. This could be either for a single repetition, in other words a 1 rep max, and also relevant for this video is repetition strength, which refers to the amount of load we can lift for a given number of repetitions. For example, the maximum amount of load we can lift for 10 reps would be called a 10 rep max. Regardless of what rep range we define strength with, the key principle to understand is that strength is ultimately a performance outcome. Hypertrophy, on the other hand, refers to an increase in the size of the muscle. Without going into too much detail, this is primarily achieved by increasing the number of myofibrils in the muscle, which is simply the smallest unit of contractile tissue. A greater number of myofibrils makes each muscle fiber larger in diameter, giving us a bigger overall muscle belly. The exact physiology of how hypertrophy works is not really important for this video. The key thing to understand is that hypertrophy purely refers to a structural adaptation, not a performance outcome. So now that we understand the differences between strength and hypertrophy, let's now cover what relationship these two adaptations have with each other. First, let's look at the general correlation between muscle size and strength. This study explored the relationship between muscle size and various strength measures in untrained men. As we can see in this graph, there is a clear positive relationship between muscle fiber size and maximal isometric strength. However, this study was in untrained men performing an unfamiliar strength task. Another study explored the relationship between muscle mass and strength in elite powerlifters. Because the subjects were elite powerlifters, it controls for the neural efficiency and technique side of things, as we would assume these athletes would be highly proficient with the powerlifts. It was found that muscle mass had a very strong correlation with squat, bench press, and deadlift performance, even more so than the previous study. Together, these studies suggest that muscle mass and strength are certainly correlated. However, we know that correlation doesn't necessarily equal causation. So we now need to explore in more detail the influence of hypertrophy on strength gains, and if strength gains could potentially influence hypertrophy outcomes. First, let's explore whether hypertrophy contributes to strength gains. It makes logical and theoretical sense that a bigger muscle would allow trainees to lift more weight, with all other factors being equal. This is because more muscle mass provides more contractile tissue to be able to produce force with. This theory is also confirmed by the research. This research review explored the effects of hypertrophy on strength gains. It was concluded that while hypertrophy training may not significantly contribute to strength gains in the short term, it certainly seems to be a long-term contributor to maximal strength. Now let's explore whether the opposite is true. Does improving strength contribute to muscle growth? The theory here is that becoming stronger can allow trainees to handle heavier loads for hypertrophy training. This would then theoretically allow trainees to induce a superior hypertrophy stimulus, resulting in greater long-term muscle growth. The counter-argument to this would be that as long as we train the muscle to a sufficient proximity from failure, then the load used isn't really important. This is still an emerging field of evidence, so we don't fully understand this concept yet. This theory was mainly triggered by a recent study. This study explored the effects of strength training on hypertrophy outcomes. One group performed a 3-week strength block before a 5-week hypertrophy phase, and the other group performed an 8-week hypertrophy only program. It was found that performing the strength phase first resulted in superior muscle growth outcomes at the end of the study compared with performing the hypertrophy only protocol. However, since then, another study was published exploring the same general topic. However, this study found different results. Trainees performed both a strength and hypertrophy phase sequentially. One group performed the hypertrophy phase first, followed by the strength phase, while the other group performed the strength phase first and the hypertrophy phase second. It was found that there were no significant differences in hypertrophy outcomes between either order of training. If anything, there actually appeared to be a slight trend in favour of performing the hypertrophy phase first. So we don't really have any conclusive evidence yet that strength can enhance hypertrophy outcomes, and the theoretical reasoning is much less convincing. So strength training may potentially result in favourable muscle growth outcomes in the long term, but more evidence is required before including this into your training program in practice. So we know that strength and hypertrophy have a pretty close relationship. So does this mean that if we improve lifting performance, it is a sign that we have built muscle? Well, the answer is yes and no. Another factor we need to consider here are fluctuations in lifting performance. Lifting performance is subject to short-term fluctuations based on various different factors, such as technique, interset rest, motivation, and more. However, what we need to keep in mind is that for hypertrophy training, the goal is to maximally stress the muscle, not necessarily to lift the most amount of weight possible. Therefore, we aren't trying to manipulate these variables to improve performance, rather we should focus on trying to maximally stress the target muscle. To outline how some of these variables can influence performance fluctuations, let's use an example. Performance will be inhibited if a trainee lifts with strict technique, full range of motion, a controlled tempo, a less biomechanically efficient technique, when the trainee is not maximally neurally efficient, when they implement shorter rest periods, they aren't as motivated to train, and have had a poor night of sleep. This doesn't necessarily mean that the hypertrophy stimulus was poor, it simply means that short-term performance will be reduced. On the other hand, performance will be maximized by lifting with less strict technique, partial range of motion, a faster tempo, greater biomechanical efficiency when we are neurally efficient at the lift, with longer interset rest periods, with increased motivation, and with a good night of sleep. Once again, this doesn't necessarily mean that this will provide a better hypertrophic stimulus, it just means we are able to lift more weight in the short term. So considering these variables, let's say that performance is subject to around a plus or minus 10% fluctuation in the short term. So if we use day-to-day or week-to-week performance as an indicator of muscle growth, then it can lead to a false perception of progress. So does this mean that we should just ignore performance completely for hypertrophy training? Well, the answer once again is yes and no. Performance can be a useful indicator of long-term muscle growth, but it is probably not very useful for short-term assessment. To demonstrate this idea, let's look at this graph. Here we have a graph depicting long-term muscle growth across a training career. As we can see, we have a faster rate of muscle growth earlier in a lifter's career and a slower rate of muscle growth as a trainee becomes more advanced. Because muscle mass appears to be a long-term driver of strength, we can also use this same graph to depict strength potential. Furthermore, we know that performance is subject to acute fluctuation, which we approximated as around plus or minus 10%. So I have included this error margin as these dotted lines above and below our solid line. The area between the two dotted lines indicates the potential performance fluctuation that can occur in the short term. So if we use an example of short-term performance assessment, we can understand why it is not a good indicator of muscle growth. Let's take these two time points, which might be something like a few weeks apart. So we have the time point and the error margins. As we can see, the error margins overlap significantly. This means that between these two time points, our true muscle growth will be masked by short-term fluctuations in performance. Therefore, comparing performance from session to session or week to week probably doesn't reflect true hypertrophy adaptations. The performance changes could be due to a number of different factors. However, where performance outcomes can be a good indicator for muscle growth is from a long-term perspective. Here we have a long-term performance comparison, let's say multiple months or even years. As we can see, the error bars don't overlap. This would indicate that these performance changes are more likely a result of long-term muscle growth rather than short-term fluctuations. Furthermore, it should also be noted that even long-term performance assessment may not always be a reliable indicator. For advanced lifters, performance fluctuations may mask muscle growth outcomes for the rest of their lifting career. In this example, these 2 points depict a long-term time frame, but as we can see, the error bars still overlap. This means that even from a long-term perspective, the potential fluctuations in performance are still greater than the true hypertrophy adaptations occurring. So what does all of this mean from a practical perspective? Well, it suggests that lifting performance is probably not a good indicator of muscle growth in the short term. However, performance can be a useful tool to assess long-term muscle growth. It should also be noted that this is a more accurate tool for less advanced trainees and a less useful indicator for highly advanced lifters. Furthermore, lifting performance will be a better indicator when we control for other variables. So if we always use strict and effective technique, use full range of motion, have similar rest periods, etc., performance changes will be a more accurate indicator of muscle growth. So in practice, we should probably focus on providing an effective hypertrophy stimulus each session by maximizing stress of the target muscle. Then, we can assess performance retrospectively, say over multiple months and years, as a general indicator of long-term muscle growth. Thanks for watching, and hopefully you got something out of this video. Check out flowhighperformance.com for online coaching, training templates, ebooks, and more.